Welcome to Vertical City. I'm your host, Lennon Richardson. During each episode, I interview one of the world's top experts in architecture, urban design, engineering, or ecology so that we can better understand and develop solutions for sustainable living. Thank you for listening, and get ready to join us on another groundbreaking and uplifting episode. I'm joined today by Mark, Perry, and Michelle, who are the co-hosts of the Tiny House podcast, which is the #1 rated tiny house show on iTunes. We discuss the rapid growth of the tiny house movement and what the vertical city movement can learn from this growth. We also discuss the similarities and differences between these two concepts, which may have more in common than you'd initially think. This interview takes place at NedSpace, which is a 15,000 square foot co-working space for startups, freelancers, and entrepreneurs in the heart of downtown Portland. Links to the Tiny House podcast, NedSpace, and everything else discussed in this show can be found by visiting verticalcity.org/podcast. All right, Mark, Perry, and Michelle, welcome to the Vertical City podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to start off just by having you each give a brief personal introduction and how you got involved into the tiny house movement.
This is Mark Grimes. I got involved when Perry and myself were looking at doing a home development with container homes.
Okay.
And then that led to the tiny home movement. And that led to other things that I'll let Perry go into.
God, that was the shortest bio of you in history.
No, I mean, if I go into everything, everybody will just
That's true.
nod off.
Okay, and I'm Perry, and like Mark said, we got into this through container homes, and Mark and I have been doing business in the entrepreneur space for about 6 years now. I also run an organization called Copiosis.com, which is inventing a new socioeconomic system for the planet. So tiny houses is a part of the things that I do with Mark, and then I have this other thing on the side. And Mark has a bunch of other things on the side, too, that he did not mention.
Yeah,
a bunch of things.
My name is Michelle. I'm a single mom of 2 college-aged children. So I'm looking forward to being an empty nester and looking forward to retirement, but really don't have any money. My life has been sort of a series of unfortunate events. So I discovered the tiny house movement, and the more I looked into it, the more it seemed like it was a really perfect option for me to pursue, again, as a retirement or an empty nest kind of scenario.
Oh, excellent. So, do any of you live in tiny homes?
I currently occupy my tiny house. It's 204 square feet. I currently occupy it part-time. So this is the process now where I'm weaning myself off of my children, and they're weaning themselves off of me. So every once in a while, I declare tiny house Tuesday or tiny house Thursday, and then I go live in my tiny house.
So we at the podcast like to say that Michelle is our credibility into the tiny house movement.
Oh, thank
since
you.
Mark
That's
and I
very
mostly
nice.
run from the outside.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine, because, I don't live in a vertical city either.
Does anybody?
Yeah, I was going to say, but at least I have a good excuse.
Maybe someday, exactly.
So I actually know both Perry and Mark from the vertical city concept. You guys came to a couple of our meetings, and so I'm curious to know, what was it that sparked your interest into this concept of vertical cities?
Well, first for me, I know Ray, and so it was a kind of a favor to Ray, firstly, but also it's there's so many connections between vertical cities and what I'm doing with Copiosis and what Mark and I are doing with tiny houses from my perspective, that it just made sense to get involved and find out more about what you're doing or what the movement is all about. And I really like the concept of the vertical city because it like I said, it's the future. I think one of the possible futures.
Sure.
In terms of organizing human civilization, and I really like the technological reliance and the potential outcomes that can come from that kind of an arrangement of human society instead of the sprawl that we have today. So that's why I got involved. And of course, you're just a handsome guy.
Well, I appreciate that.
I'm just kidding.
It's a good thing we're on radio. Anyway.
I think that was my line. But you can have it. That works.
Thanks, Michelle.
For me personally, it was, Ray working on the book with his dad and helping his dad with the Vertical City book, but it was kind of bringing in, they were seeing if there was a crossover in concept with tiny houses and vertical cities, meaning you can have a vertical city of 500 stories where only one person lives on a floor, and that's only 500 people, and that's not very sustainable.
Right. Nice.
But at one point in time, I did the math, and I'm going to mess it up, but I divided a vertical city or a building of average square feet by 188 square feet, which is the amount an average tiny house is, and it was like 22 or 23,000 people could actually live in that if they embrace that lifestyle. And then I figured how many homes it would take to have the whole planet live in. That must have been a very ADD day, but anyway, it's like, so I kind of tried to bring that mentality to it of it doesn't have to be even whatever the average square foot now is per home, 1,800 square feet or whatever. It could actually be a lot less too.
Yeah.
There was another format of a vertical type city structure that I saw before Ray and you, Lennon, had approached through Mark, that had a concept of a skyscraper that was basically a farm. And so every layer of the building, or before the building, was doing some sort of agriculture project. And so I found it fascinating that you approached us when I had already seen that thing. So it was really cool.
Are you speaking of Dixon Despommier with the vertical farm concept, or is this something?
It may be. I saw it so long ago I don't remember.
He was one of our guests on the podcast just recently.
Oh, nice.
Right on.
All right. So for Michelle, just kind of briefly give you the 2-sentence explanation of a vertical city, and then see if you can give me your sort of initial reaction to it. The vertical city is basically a series of towers. These are mega towers, taller than anything that's been built currently, but they're also tied together by sky lobbies, which create means of passage between the two towers, and also they create outdoor spaces that mimic the ground level, but in the vertical plane. And this has been put forth as a potential solution to a lot of our problems. But before I really give you too much information, I wanted to see what your initial gut reaction to this idea is.
So my gut reaction is on two levels. My first level is safety and stairs and earthquakes and architecture and all that fun stuff, which I'm sure you've covered with your other guests, because I would have a million questions along those lines. But my second reaction, and probably equally as strong, was really that's very fascinating. When I discovered the tiny house movement, that was my really, what? How does that work? And so the reaction I have to what you just said is equal to the almost the same reaction I had for tiny houses. Let me see, how would that work? How could I fit everything I need into this space? And so equal levels of list of questions and fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, I think it's like any new concept that's kind of out there on the fringe, if it's going to have both good and bad things to it. So I will just kind of briefly touch on the safety. One of the major benefits is actually the means of egress that you have, because you can move between the towers. So if something happens in one, you can just jump over to the other and get your way out.
Right.
Another comment I want to make here is that obviously both of these movements, something that's similar to both these concepts, is that they're not for everybody. And that I want to kind of start asking you guys a bit about what are some of the obstacles you run into when trying to spread this word about the tiny houses.
We actually did an interview recently with someone, and speaking of numbers that I'm going to screw up, we actually did an interview recently about the cross-section of the American household. And I think one of the barriers that the tiny house movement meets, and I think one of the barriers that society in general meets, is this notion that there is a normal family. Mm-hmm. And so I think overcoming that notion and understanding, according to our guest at the time, she said less than 23% of the households in the United States are currently made up with what's called a core family. So that is basically two parents and one or two children. That's less than 23% of the households in America. So when you start to think about that the households are much more diverse, they're a lot smaller, they're a lot different, and when you consider that the housing stock, to use a very technical term, that the housing stock was actually built specifically for that core unit, that core family, which is obviously now a minority, that's an interesting dichotomy, and that's an interesting barrier to people's perceptions of housing and families and how families are living in housing that was actually not even designed for them.
So we have this model of the single-family home, which had more relevance in the past, but it's becoming less and less relevant, but people are still holding on to that idea, if I'm kind of summarizing your points.
See, there you go. That's why you're the host. You got the summarizing skill down set.
What about for you guys? Is there anything else that you've kind of had as a problem getting people to take this idea?
Well, for me, my experiences were in the tiny house movement, and so we're not in a
We don't talk
advocacy.
to people outside of it,
we're not an
really?
advocacy group.
I'm lucky to be here.
Yeah, so we don't have.
You have no idea.
Although it might be interesting to talk to people on our show about who aren't interested in.
We talk to people who, because they live it, are constantly exposed to those people.
Sure.
Yes.
And I think like so many other movements, both vertical city and tiny house movement is, at first everybody thinks it's a joke, or they think it's impossible, or they think
Right.
it can never happen. And when you go back, when we talked to a guy that wrote a book in the 70s, wasn't that
Les Walker?
Yeah, Les Walker, a book in the 70s about this. So, and if you go back to the 30s, people just lived in homes that happened to be tiny. Right? It's just they've grown over the years, so it's not like it's that unusual. But people push back because they feel like, well, if they're not doing it, maybe they're doing something wrong.
I see.
And that kind of thing. So there's definitely still some skepticism out, but there's also a tremendous amount of curiosity because there's 5 TV shows on cable now about these things.
Well, it's interesting because, as Mark mentions, just today, and with our host, our guest, we were talking about her family and her husband's family, who both of whom were like, "What are you doing? What are you going to do to your? Look what you're going to do to your kids. This is a terrible idea." And then as they moved into the house and people started to see the benefits that were being produced from living in that tiny house, the families were like, "Wow, maybe we should do that when we retire." That kind of a thing. And so it's just like any other perceived to be new thing. There's nothing new under the sun, but perceived to be new thing. People are going to fight against it or claim that the people that are doing it are crackpots or screwing their children or something like that. But as it gains more momentum and acceptance, then people just kind of come around, right?
As you were speaking about that, I was thinking about this marketing curve that I've often seen. It's like the rate of adaptation. You're familiar with it?
The product adoption curve. Yeah.
Where on that curve is the tiny house movement?
It's breaking into the first half of mainstream.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say. Yeah. The early, not the early evangelists, not the early adopters,
right?
but the early
majority.
Early majority.
The early
majority. Yeah.
As there are more kids that can't afford housing, when you look at what's happening in Portland right now, where the average rent's $2,200 a month, and people can't afford that, so they want to build their own thing or have their own life experience. And then the other side of things, which is people on the retirement side, women 45, 50 or older who just don't have the money built up, who can then go out and do this. So that's becoming more mainstream, which eventually will kind of force down to the middle. Which in some ways is kind of like the people we talked to today, a family of 4 in a little tiny house. And they're really enjoying their life, and they're not getting wrapped up in the crap that surrounds their life. It's the experiences, not the things.
Yeah, totally.
I have a specific example to answer that question as well. I've never seen the marketing curve, so I'm outside the education loop on this in this room. But there was an event somewhat recently, and when they started setting it up, they thought there'd be maybe a couple thousand people. And everyone was really shocked when, over the course of the 3-day event, over 40,000 people showed up, totally out of the blue. It was even way bigger than the people inside the movement actually thought it was.
Yeah, that's bigger than I thought too. I started hearing about this a couple of years ago, and I was definitely very fringe at that time. But if there's that many people showing up to a conference, then it's definitely entering the majority.
Yeah, and one of the attendees at that meeting, at that event, said that the people who were attending were basically the middle income people who could afford to attend. So there was way more people than that. It's just that those people could afford a flight and lodging to come to that event. But what I see really interesting about when Mark and I were talking about retirement, not our retirement, but people retiring and how to put
You're breaking a story.
I know. About what we're going to do, what they're going to do with their where they're going to live when they retire. At the time, I didn't see how all these pieces were going to fit together to make tiny houses popular, but now they are. And I can see how the elements that are making tiny houses attractive are the precursor to the elements that could perhaps make vertical cities attractive.
Nice time.
It is, because the host or the guest before last, I think, Dumpster.
Oh.
Professor
Dumpster. Yeah, he's created.
I bet you nobody's talked about that on the
Exactly.
Professor Dumpster.
Oh yeah, that guy. We all know him. He's a good friend.
He's actually working on this multiple unit housing system that's called a rack. It's actually called casita.
Casita with a K.
Yeah, and what they are these pods essentially that are basically modern tiny houses that can slide into a rack. And so
I think I've seen that.
Yeah. And so it seems to me, just thinking kind of meta about what we're talking about, that we're going from McMansions to tiny houses to these modular rack things, and that could easily adapt to the type of structure that you're talking about on this show. So it's very interesting. I didn't consider how the dots would connect when we were first talking about tiny houses and what are people going to do when they don't have retirement, like Michelle, no offense. And now it's like I want to say, because of where I kind of operate most of my life, the universe is kind of making this thing kind of happen. I just see the possibility of a vertical city actually being real now.
The retirement aspect is interesting. That's something that came up in a documentary that we were in the midst of producing that we'll be releasing soon. And it kind of struck me as new and interesting, a way of approaching this concept. I hadn't really thought about that before, but with the vertical city concept, there would be so many amenities provided to those who are in retirement.
It'll be I'm interested to know, how is all this happening in a vertical city? Is it happening in the context of capitalism, or are you guys envisioning that something else happens that allows? I mean, it seems like those are extremely expensive endeavors, and the people who would be able to live in them are not going to be the people who haven't saved for retirement.
So it's definitely not going to be an exclusive society by any means. It will take a lot of capital to create one, and so we don't have all the answers. But sort of where we're leaning at the moment is a place like China, where they have a great degree of central control, and they basically just
do it.
Yeah, do it.
Yeah.
So that's what we're thinking would probably be like the most likely place to see a vertical city would be in China. And then once the developers and the investors get together and make it happen, then there'd be housing options available for all income spectrums.
Interesting.
Well, and as you think about the retirement model in a vertical city application, however, I actually see, rather than taking our, existing elder home and just making it taller, I actually see, like China, that you would do more of a multi-generational sort of scenario where the grandchildren have full access to the grandparents and the great-grandparents, and the parents leverage off the skill sets of the other family members. And so that actually makes it less expensive as a retirement, community, because you don't have to hire people to actually check in on your elder family members. It becomes a part of your everyday life and their everyday sort of existence.
Maybe you could extend the vertical city downward into the earth, so that not only you have your living generations above you, but you have your dead generation.
Whoa.
Mausoleum, so that now you could go visit your ancestors in your vertical downward city.
Nice. The more you pay, the higher.
Write that one down.
Exactly.
You gotta write. You take notes.
It's recorded.
We're gonna call it Perry's floor or something, right?
Michelle, you actually gave me a really interesting idea just now, because one of the things that China is struggling with is that is their model. That's how it's always been. You just live in these multi-generational homes, but more and more that's changing because there's opportunities in the big cities. So the youth are flooding in the masses, and something like the vertical city could potentially alleviate that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, because of where I'm coming from around Copiosis, it seems that this has to develop in concert with some other kind of economic plan, because if you have, I think the reason why the youth are flocking to the cities is because obviously there's more economic opportunity there, and therefore if they're coming from the rural areas of China, I'm presuming you mean putting a vertical city in a rural area of China?
I don't think that's where it would be. I think it would be in a place where the people want to be. So
as the youth would migrate to the urban center, so would the entire generation of that youth's family?
This is a new idea for me.
Yeah, this is what you got to wrestle with, I think, is how do you do that? It's and then what happens to the community that was established in the opposite? What's opposite of urban? Suburban.
Suburban.
There's the rural area. So it's interesting. There's a lot of dynamics that are involved in creating this idea, I think, that need to be explored still. Not that it's not possible. It's just
right. It is. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of questions that still need to be answered. I guess I'm not the expert by any means, but I would kind of see it happening that the youth would probably be the people who would adapt to it first, because the youth are always the ones who adapt to new ideas. Yeah. And then over time, it would become multi-generational.
Yeah. Oh, I see. So the first wave of youth would be in there, and then as they age, they would become the older generation, and the second youth, or maybe their children, would stay in there with them.
Yeah, that's a potential.
I see. Yeah.
Actually, I think the faster that this type of a concept actually embraces sort of multicultural kind of structure, the faster it would actually be accepted. So, again, comparing it to tiny houses, it originally, I think the early tiny housers and a lot of the, we'll call them movers and shakers, they built and developed and occupied tiny houses when they were single adults. And now, as the tiny house movement progresses into mainstream, there are people that want to baby boomers that want to downsize. There are off-gridders. There, off-gridders and preppers and those types of people that like to live in small spaces, out of the way of society. There are people just graduating from college that have huge amount of debt. Mm-hmm. There are very small startup families that are still paying off their college debt before their children reach teenage age. So the tiny house movement and I think the vertical cities both have the potential to actually reach and actually be accepted by a broad range, a really, really wide demographic of people.
Well, especially if it's in the context of this vertical city thing, because it's no longer just a tiny house sitting on a piece of land somewhere or in a commune that's kind of isolated from the rest of civilization experience, so to speak. It's interesting that the one thing that I see different potentially in between a tiny house experience and the vertical city experience is that with a tiny house experience, it's so customized to the individual. Yeah. It's like a living piece. It's a structural extension of who they are in the physical reality, right? And so is the vertical city going to be created in such a way that people like Michelle can go into that space and be able to wholly customize it like she can do her tiny house space? It'd be interesting, right?
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah.
And I actually have a question for the room here. So what percentage, we haven't talked about this before, but I think it would be appropriate, what percentage of people that are in tiny houses right now do you think are introverts versus extroverts? Because I think the main difference between the tiny house movement, and like you were talking, sort of, we're going to expand upon that concept a little bit, is the tiny house movement is kind of introverted, right? I'm going to go to my little space and sit in my little cocoon, and I'm going to venture out kind of when I have to. But I see cities as being really appeal to the extroverts and the people that really want to be out there. And does the rest of the rest of the vertical city become the outdoors? How does introvert extrovert play into this movement, do you think?
For the vertical city?
For both.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the tiny house, but for the vertical city, one of our major emphasis is on the social aspects. And one thing that's kind of tough about the large towers that we have now is there's less chances for accidental interactions. And so by creating these multiple spaces where there's lots of public spaces, it's a chance to get to know your neighbors.
One of the interesting things I question about, not that it's a negative, but with the vertical cities is when you get to a certain altitude, the atmosphere changes. And so and wind currents change. I mean, wind becomes much stronger as you get higher up. And so when you talk about outdoor spaces, I'm using air quotes, are these exposed to the element outdoor spaces, or are they really interior manufactured outdoor spaces?
They would be exposed to the elements.
So when you're up 500 stories, how many feet is that?
It's the equivalent of the Antarctic, right?
Ice will form.
Yeah, it's cold and it's windy.
It is cold and windy. Yeah. So you can basically block the wind with a wind barricade, but there's also advantages to the fact that it's cold and windy up there as well, which is that you can use the wind to...
Well, for sure.
Right,
yeah, for wind power and what.
And you can draw the cold air down, but as far as the outdoor spaces, that's a good question. I haven't really talked with anybody about that.
Well, that, and then the atmosphere itself is thinner, and so people, I guess, are going to develop like they do in Colorado, where they can run much farther and jump higher because they're in thinner atmosphere. So how do you... Yeah, how do you address that is my question, especially when you're living that high. I mean, I could see certainly having the outdoor spaces low, but at a certain point, it kind of becomes an issue for...
Yeah, I wonder what point that is.
Yeah.
Is it a half mile? Is it a mile?
Well, it's interesting, yeah. I mean, I think at think at 15,000 feet is when you have to be on oxygen, I think, in an airplane, I think. So I don't know. But I know for sure 30,000. Do they go up to 30,000 feet, the vertical safe spaces?
The
cities?
current model is up to a mile high.
So, it's only 5,000 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not.
I remember being in the World Trade Center on a pretty sunny day, and like chunks of ice were falling from the roof because that's just so cold up there.
Right,
So it's like,
right.
light keeps falling by the window, and it was ice.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5,000. The air's a little thin, but it's not too
It's not
bad.
too bad
It's
up
not too
there.
bad. My ex has property at the 5,000 foot level of the mountain, and you notice it, but something that 2 days later you don't really.
Oh, okay.
You don't really notice too much.
Yeah. But the wind is also important and something that needs more consideration because the wind is a lot stronger up there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm assuming, or just kind of guessing too, but due to the kind of nature of the way this wants to be built as the most environmental friendly possible, that anything from solar to wind is being harnessed into energy anyway.
Exactly,
So the
yeah.
fact it's stronger, it's just a matter of how does that get converted into
I agree.
into building energy.
Yeah. It is. I don't think the wind is a problem structurally. I'm just thinking like outdoor spaces. If someone's outdoors
Yeah.
and it's blowing 20,
blown over.
30 miles an hour,
Right.
no one's going to want to be outside.
Right.
I'm going to the lower levels. now.
Exactly.
As I said, though, I mean, it really depends on the experience that you want to have on the outdoors. I mean,
Sure.
you do have people that go to mountains and
That's a good point.
and
Yeah.
like to like to experience that, and they could actually go camping in their own little version of the
Yeah.
South Pole or something. And so,
Or sit in a hot
the-
tub up there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I mean, I still think there's some possibility to sort of almost embrace the the elephant in the room. Yeah, it's cold, but we've got hot tubs and we've got
Hot chocolate.
hot chocolate, and if you want to experience that, that's available, which would be another really cool, unique feature.
Yeah, that would
if
actually.
that's kind of architecturally where they want to go.
Right.
And I think we're talking about a 10-degree temperature variance.
At a mile?
At a mile.
Probably, yeah.
That's not too bad.
No.
As long as it's built in the right city.
Right.
So that'd be ideal in the summer.
Yeah.
But old people want it hot.
Exactly.
They can have a-
Turn the heat up and turn that television up.
They'll have to stick it lower, exactly.
Lower and louder.
So we were talking just a moment ago about how this housing movement, the tiny house movement, is exploding. What do you think have been the key drivers to that? Anybody can answer this.
Well, as I already mentioned, I think it's just because of the fact that it just reaches such a broad demographic. It started in this one little sort of fringe society-ish. I think that's part of it. I think the second answer to your question, I'll try to be more succinct, is television. Television has had a huge impact. I think that the tiny house movement has reached its tipping point. Like Mark mentioned earlier, there's 5 tiny house television shows right now. Anybody that I even mentioned that I'm a tiny house, enthusiast, I've seen them on TV. Like 90% of the time, if I'm outside the tiny house movement and I mention a tiny house, that's their response.
Yeah,
So,
people know what it means now.
big time, and they actually understand it's 200 square feet. It's for my version. There are many versions of tiny houses.
Okay.
But the version right now that's being presented to the mainstream society is the tiny house on wheels model. So the television is a big thing, and then again understanding the demographics and how they appeal to such a broad demographic.
I think 2007, 2008 is what kicked it off.
I agree. Yeah.
It's the economy and the
yeah.
sugar.
Economy.
I mean,
Oh,
people
I
are
see
like,
what you
I can't
mean.
afford anything.
Yeah.
What can I do? How can I not
Plus they
live in
had
a
a lot of
cardboard
debt.
box and still live in something that works?
Yeah.
Right.
And they had a lot of debt at that time too,
Yeah.
and all their
Yeah.
money was gone, and so they
People
had to
really
figure out-
reevaluated things.
Yeah, and then there's also the ethical aspect where the people who started it were like, screw mainstream society. I don't want to have a bunch of crap. I'd rather have quality of life over living to pay for a huge mortgage.
Yeah.
Let me do something different. And then it was also the artistic appeal of these things. It's like, wow, that thing is aesthetically beautiful. And you're telling me I can build my own? That kind of a thing.
Well, tiny houses are the Twitter of homes.
Yeah,
Okay.
very
You don't have
good.
140
Very
characters.
good.
When you have such
Yeah.
a small space,
Yeah.
you have to think about every
Yeah.
element in it. So it becomes this well-designed thing, and like an iPhone. It's like, how can you make it so little but it becomes so much? And that's what a lot of the tiny house early adopters have really
Yeah, that's
been drawn to.
That's true. 2008 totally changed my perception. I have built and I have owned and I've lost 2 conventional houses before. I always grew up thinking that I would own, and I have, conventional houses. But you're right, 2008 was a big mind shift for me. I didn't discover tiny houses till 2013. But mentally, after that happened, I was like, oh crap, I'm never going to own a house again. I'm never going to be able to afford to own a house. I'm not going to be able to afford to retire and use my house, as security for retirement. So you're right. Mentally, I made the shift in about 2008, but it took me a while to sort of find tiny houses as a solution.
Yeah, you recognized the problem in 2008, but you had to find the solution.
Yep.
So I had asked that question in hopes that I could get some insights into how to spark the vertical city movement.
Well, that's interesting because I don't think the tiny house movement was an intentional sparking thing. It was a confluence.
It was an outcome.
It was an outcome of combining. Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about what Vertical Cities is doing is it's already come together, and so.
Vertical Cities?
Yeah, it's already come together as a concept.
I see. Gotcha.
And so
the concept leads the demand.
Yes, the concept. Thank you. It's like, was it in our podcast where someone said that was talking about the Apple quote that people don't? Yeah, it was Professor Dumpster.
Professor Dumpster. People don't know what they need.
Yeah,
you have to tell them.
You got to tell them what they need, and so I think this is that example where people don't know that they're going to want to live in a 500-story building, and so you got to create it for them and show them and. That's how you get it going, I think.
Yeah.
Well, one thing we haven't talked a lot about yet, that is also sustainability. We kind of mentioned harnessing wind and harnessing solar to help power a vertical city. I talked about the demographics of tiny houses. But regardless of who you are in a tiny house, being environmentally conscious is very, very common. My tiny house, actually plugged in, consumes 5 times the entire house with all the lights on and everything on going at once, consumes about half as much electricity as a toaster. Wow. So it's extremely environmentally friendly as far as that goes. And so, again, I think in advancing a vertical city concept is also appealing to the people that are thinking about saving the planet or making sure we don't have to. Making sure we're destroying the planet at least much more slowly.
The other thing with tiny houses that has been weird, at least for some in the past too, is you build this really sustainable tiny house, 188 square feet. People are talking about the greenness and sustainability of it, and then they drop it on like 2 acres.
Okay.
It's like, wow, what a waste of land. So I think the next thing that might happen in tiny houses and or ADUs, accessory dwelling units, but tiny houses is communities of tiny houses. So, because many people don't want to be stuck on 2 acres or more by yourself, where all of a sudden you're doing this whole walled-in pond thing. So all of a sudden you may get these kind of groups of well-placed homes where people kind of have a community, but have their own separate tiny house space. And then from that, Vertical City just kind of swoops in and say, what if we stack these things?
It's a start.
That is what would make people go, well, yeah, we could do that.
Yeah.
Right. That would be the evolution.
It could be.
That would sort of be the evolution in the marrying.
One saying it will be because you prove me wrong.
So currently, are most people doing the tiny houses on their own, or are there large communities?
There are becoming communities in Florida.
Not large ones,
well,
right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about building a city.
We talked about, eventually.
Yeah,
but like right now in Portland, I think there's groups of 5 or 6 together, little chunks.
Yeah.
I think the biggest one right now that I even know of, you're right, is in Florida. I think they have a dozen down in Florida. So not large by any means, but primarily the reason is not because there's not demand for tiny house communities. The reason is because the zoning regulations just don't embrace them. They don't acknowledge them.
Okay.
The zoning and the municipalities have a hard time sort of wrapping their head around what would that community look like and how to make that happen. So there's a ton of demand, but it's going to take leaders, it's going to take some money, it's going to take some advocacy to actually make that happen. Similar to your project as well, though, of course.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
For sure.
You have the same hurdles in many respects as the tiny house movement.
What I think is totally different, though, is if as an individual, I can just go out if I have enough resources and just build my own tiny house, right? There's no way. There's probably not a single person in the world who could, even if they threw their entire wealth at it, could build.
Elon Musk could probably do it. I mean, he's doing the Hyperloop.
It's going to take some coordinated effort, I think.
It's going to take billions.
Yeah, it's going to take billions.
He could do it.
So it's putting a rocket into space, and he's got that accomplished. I mean,
yeah, but I mean, I'm saying like he's doing that with other people, though.
Right.
He didn't say just like, okay, here's my money.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
I'm ready.
I'm going to build my own vertical city by myself.
I'm going to build my own rocket.
Tailor it myself.
Right.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, absolutely. That's, of course, the major difference.
Yeah.
But on the flip hand side, there are not really individuals that are going out and forming these communities, right? So,
That's correct.
So there's individuals like me that will build my own tiny house, but I don't have the money by myself to go out and form a community or buy a large piece of property. So again, from that concept, maybe it's not, I mean, the scale is obviously the number of zeros behind the commas are obviously, you know, an entirely different universe, but no, we might have more in common than you think.
Well, yeah, I was thinking a lot about it coming into this interview and trying to identify what are some of the common aspects. And I think that there is more in common than people would think on the surface between these two totally drastic concepts, at least drastic in scale.
I think so. I think it's interesting. It goes back to the confluence of events that are occurring, because I think when Casita comes out, it's a really close mirror or connection between what you're doing with vertical cities and tiny houses, because it creates a modern, technologically advanced solution to living small, whereas tiny houses aren't that. Tiny houses are not highly technological. They're not modern. Most of them. I mean, some of them are.
Right. Most of them
are stick built. And the thing that Professor Dumpster is making is super modern. It's elegant. It's technology rich, and it's leaning in the direction of the vertical city. So it seems like that. In fact, you might even want to have this guy as a guest, because his idea seems like it could. A 1,000 years from now, when vertical cities are all over the place, and we're trying to track the evolution of vertical city, the Casita rack could be one of the early mans of vertical cities.
This is Professor Dumpster.
Yeah. What's his name?
Jeff Wilson.
Jeff Wilson. Yeah.
Okay.
Wilson. But no, people are still going to be trying to figure out how all the floors below ground somehow got named Harry.
That's right.
And the conversations will still be poop, pee, and sex.
Exactly.
Because that's what we hear a lot of.
It took us longer than 20 minutes in this conversation.
Yeah.
So just to bring your listeners up to speed, there's this sort of urban myth about tiny houses that it takes less than 10 minutes for any tiny house discussion to travel in the direction of either poop or sex. So we're there, but it took us longer than 10 minutes. Maybe it's because there's so many stories on the vertical cities that it takes a little longer to get there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So far on this podcast, we've had pretty much experts who are also advocates of the vertical city movement. And as outsiders, I would like to further our discussion about what are your biggest concerns around this concept as quote-unquote lay people.
Vertical city.
Yes.
I mean, one concern, as I guess it does tie to tiny houses, is that somebody does try to design it in a way that it's eating up too much space for too few people, right? That it doesn't embrace the more minimalism lifestyle that I think people are moving towards anyway, and it become a architect's
wet dream.
Thank you. I was going to put it much worse than that. But yeah, that it just become this architect's, I just want to make this statement on this landscape.
Yeah.
And
right.
Again, at 500 stories and 500 people, it's like, wow, that's just horrible. So how can you accommodate that? And diversity. How can you make it a real diverse experience, not just, hey, you got $1.5 million, dump it here and boom, and you're done. It's like, nah, how can you really bring in diversity, which makes any kind of community and culture stronger?
Well, that's my main issue, is the economic diversity of such an endeavor, because it seems to me that the expense of building something like that demands, it's like the Tesla model. It demands, the first one is, unless it's built in China like you suggested, is gonna demand very high rents.
Yeah.
And so only the rich people are going to get in there. And it's going to be almost like Elysium. Did you see the movie Elysium?
No.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so just real quickly, Elysium is about Earth far in the future, and all the super rich people live up on a space station.
Okay.
And then all the rest of the dirty, filthy
Hell on Earth
people live in hell on Earth, Earth, and it's terrible. And they don't have medical care. And up on Elysium, all the rich people have this super advanced healthcare where no one gets sick, and everyone on the planet is messed up. And so
you did it.
And so
but the sick people can go in if they have cancer. It's like, go step in that booth. Okay, you're done. You don't have cancer anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But the people on Earth
just die. Yeah, and so that's what that's an extreme example. But the guy who made that movie said he was making a statement of that is exactly how life is on Earth right now in some ways. And so I could see a vertical city being the extant example of that situation where the super wealthy get to live in this fantastic, contained, ergonomically, ecologically sustainable thing, and the rest of us have to deal with living in a, no offense with the tiny house movement, but tiny houses, and struggling to make a living.
See, I kind of envisioned something that looked a little bit like Tom's shoes of vertical cities.
Yeah.
You would have a floor for the wealthy who would help pay extra to help provide a floor of tiny houses where people would still pay.
Yes.
But so you could alternate that so you'd still get that kind of economic
diversity,
floor by floor by floor, not just the richest at the penthouse and the second and the second and the
exactly.
second, where your hierarchy is by what floor you're on.
Yes, that's the other thing is the economic capability of the individual dictates where in the tower they get to live, and that's screwed too. Like you're saying, so doing it floor by floor is totally better. Yeah. But are people going to? And so the question is, are the developers of that kind of innovation going to be thinking like we're thinking right now, or are they going to be really thinking more traditionally?
Well, we're going to have to get them to listen to the podcast, and then they'll be convinced.
Right.
right.
Exactly.
Mark, when you're talking about the floor by floor, did you mention a specific name or was it a concept? I've heard of this before, but I'm not sure what to call it.
Oh,
Tom's shoes?
Like the Tom's kind of the buy one, get one, give one.
Oh, that's what you were
referring to. Yeah. I just mean that, there's definitely social enterprise models out there where, I can't remember the name of the one that's in India. This guy developed this fantastic eye surgery. Ariand or something like that.
Yeah.
Lennon will find it and put it in your show notes.
Exactly.
But basically, so the people that can afford the eye surgery, they get them and they pay kind of a standard rate, but it helps offset the free or very inexpensive ones that the people that can't afford it get.
Yeah.
And they've streamlined it in such a way where they're literally like, this person's doing the surgery over here, and they turn around in their seat and then they do the surgery over there. So they're like, they've got this thing really streamlined. So in a home environment like this where it can be, again, it's not like you're giving it away, but you're providing it at an affordable rate.
Yeah.
Great. So we've been talking for a little bit over 40 minutes now with just the last remaining time that we have. I'm curious if there's any sort of call to actions or topics you really want to touch upon before we sign off.
Call to actions.
I think one thing people need to think of, it depends obviously where they're at in their life, but if they've hit a situation where they're dealing with downsizing, either in their own personal life or more extreme downsizing with a parent, they've gone through this system kind of once or twice where all of a sudden a house full of 2,500 square feet of junk needs to get jammed down into 300 or 400 square feet, in a retirement center. So, be mindful of the things that you continue to buy and the things you have, because at some stage it's just stuff in a box, stuff here, stuff there, that at some point in time it just ceases to kind of enrich your life, and especially for the collectors out there that collect things, right? It's like, wow, at some stage it just becomes a weight on your back. It's nothing you can really enjoy.
I definitely agree with that. My roommate, he's also a business partner of mine, he's authored a book called The Tchotchke Life Challenge. Tchotchke being like all these trinkets that we collect, and I think it's a significant problem that we face specifically here in America, that at some point these things that we believe are adding value to our lives actually become our greatest burdens.
Your stuff owns you, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
Is that something that's important to the tiny house people?
What?
Like, is that a conversation that's often had that's driving it?
Oh, absolutely.
I don't need the stuff.
Well, yeah, it's arrived at in a couple of different directions. One direction is the people are knowing they're moving to a tiny house, and so they are choosing on the initiative to get rid of all of their stuff. And then the other one is they're moving into a tiny house and they're forced to give up all their stuff. And so, we were just talking with our guest today, who had an unexpected result. So like she moved into a tiny house with her husband and her 2 kids from a 2,000 square foot house into a 267 square foot tiny house. And her children in the 2,000 square foot house would often sit around engaging in screen time or being listless inside the house. But when they moved into this tiny house, of course, they couldn't take all their toys. And they didn't have the space, obviously. And so the kids, according to her, are now moving around more. They're seeking more playtime outside. They're playing more with sticks and stones instead of like, I don't know, Legos.
Gadgets.
Gadgets, thanks. Gadgets. And they're reading. More creative play is occurring. And she said she didn't expect this as a result, but that is the result. And so, I think a lot of, one of the big wonderful epiphanies that people have when they move into a tiny house is the freedom they gain from the what did you call it? The Chotsky what?
The Chotsky challenge.
They have a Chotsky enlightenment or something like that, where they realize that, wow, these things that there was another guest that was talking about
there's the guys that have the 2 tiny house, and they were talking about their kids.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about the I can't remember their names, but anyway, they were talking about when they were moving, they pulled this box out and it said, open this first, or this is very important or something. And when they opened it, it was something like a salad spinner or something like that.
Yeah, and they found it like a lot later too. They're like, what were we thinking? Why is that important?
Yeah, and they were even questioning who those people were. They were themselves, but who they were. That they would think that's so. Yeah,
the salad spinner.
It wasn't exactly a salad spinner, but it was like that. Mm-hmm. And so it was like, wow, who were we that we thought that this salad spinner was important?
We had some friends that moved overseas, and they packed up, I think it was 3 containers, in essence. I mean, not shipping.
Oh, okay.
Other containers worth of their stuff. One went with them, the other 2 stayed here. They moved back. They had no idea what was in those 2 containers.
I've had a similar experience.
No idea.
Fascinating.
And I think they ended up just giving it away.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Look at storage lockers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just such a bizarre concept to me. Why would you pay to store the stuff that you can't get in your own damn house?
Yeah. I've done now 3 extended trips overseas, and each time I do it, I put my stuff somewhere, and then I come back and I scratch my head and I think, I haven't thought about this stuff for months. And then each time I kind of like get rid of half of it. So now I'm living pretty minimal.
Right. It's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
Yeah, very cool.
All right, so Perry, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to plug anything you want and inspire the world.
Oh my goodness.
Ready, go!
Inspire the world. Relative to vertical cities?
Anything you want.
Okay, well, there is a movement afoot where we are creating momentum around providing an economic system that allows everyone to enjoy food, clothing, health care, education, and shelter at no cost to them.
Wow.
In an environment where there is no money, no government, most crime is eliminated, and individuals are 100% free to live their lives in any way that they choose. And so that system is called copiosis. I believe it's right in line with what you're doing with vertical cities.
Mm-hmm.
COPIOSIS, and you can go to copiosis.com to find out more at copiosis.com, COPIOSIS.
Excellent. Mark, you get the same opportunity since you gave us a brief bio.
I was just so busy listening to Perry, I didn't even have to work anything up.
He's mesmerizing.
I know, exactly. Now I can't even say that. I just tell listeners, come check out tinyhousepodcast.com. Come give it a listen. Listen to the interview with Professor Dumpster, one of the other 33 or so interviews that we have out.
Is it just 33?
I think that's what's live now. I think we have some more that are recorded.
And just so our listeners know, Michelle has snuck out, so I'm not exiling her and not giving her.
We can just ask her, hey, Michelle.
Yeah.
So what do you got? What words of wisdom? Yeah. There we go.
Nice one.
Right.
And I think we'll end on that. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vertical City. Learn more about the Vertical City concept and continue the conversation by visiting our website, verticalcity.org. I truly hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe to our podcast, leave a review on iTunes, and most importantly, share Vertical City with your friends and colleagues so that together we can create solutions for sustainable living. I'm Lennon Richardson, signing off for the Vertical City team. See you next time.